I can't tell you how much I sympathize with the way everybody has had to endure this unbelievably testing and challenging time.
It all began with an unfinished telephone conversation. According to reports, a stunned silence washed over palace aides as they witnessed King Charles suddenly cut off a private dialogue with Queen Camilla. Informants close to the situation assert that the dispute centered around a choice regarding Laura Lopes and her entry into Sandringham. What initially appeared to be a standard domestic friction rapidly mutated into a major debate concerning heritage, devotion, and the ultimate scope of royal authority. Before we dissect what this signifies for the House of Windsor, remember to hit subscribe to ensure you stay informed on every development. Initially, royal staff attempted to manage the friction as a strictly confidential household matter. They hoped that this awkward internal strain could be quieted through strategic silence, delayed public responses, and meticulously drafted phrases. Yet, the brewing tempest was not calmed by this tight-lipped approach. Instead, the quiet only intensified the pressure. Word soon spread that Camilla had reacted with fierce resistance upon discovering that Laura Lopes had reportedly been blocked from the Sandringham estate, a property deeply tied to historic royal memories, personal sovereignty, and the age-old customs of court life. For the sovereign, this dilemma supposedly involved far more than a solitary weekend invitation or a specific name written on a visitor roster. The core issue was about drawing lines. It focused on defining exactly who possessed the right to cross into the guarded sanctuaries of the crown and who did not. Court insiders muttered that top-tier personnel were instantly instructed to avoid talking about the phone call, to never acknowledge the ban, and to withhold any explanation regarding who issued the command. This unprecedented secrecy merely heightened the volatile nature of the event. Ultimately, when the royal household refuses to offer a statement, their silence speaks with a far louder voice than any official press release. Demanding explanations, Camilla allegedly pushed for clarity. Meanwhile, Charles, already navigating the heavy burdens of his medical diagnosis, sovereign obligations, and a crown under relentless scrutiny, reportedly reached his absolute limit. That was the exact moment when a private domestic dispute crossed over into royal folklore. The connection was broken off suddenly, frostily, and without any attempts at reconciliation. Behind that definitive gesture lay a far more profound division, signaling that the monarch was no longer prepared to allow marital devotion to cloud the boundaries of sovereign duty. The name Laura Lopes acted as the catalyst, Sandringham became the arena for the clash, and Camilla's leverage was unexpectedly pushed into a public trial that very few had anticipated. However, that abrupt telephone clash merely served as the opening act, given that the origins of this confrontation ran far deeper than casual observers could guess. To the outside world, Sandringham might look like just another grand estate owned by the family. Inside the palace walls, however, it is universally regarded as an incredibly sacred refuge for the monarchy, an environment where ancient protocol consistently takes priority over blood ties. Based on multiplying accounts, this fiercely guarded status stood right at the epicenter of the current crisis. Sandringham represents far more than coordinates on a map. It functions as one of the quiet epicenters of courtly existence, a private fortress where generations of royalty have congregated under regulations far older than any contemporary domestic feud. The general public might recognize it through images of Christmas morning walks, family gatherings, and structured public appearances. Yet behind the secure entrances, royal commentators note that entry has always signified something profound. Receiving an invitation there is not merely a matter of being welcomed into a residence, it represents being granted a place close to the innermost circle of power. This is precisely why the reported restriction placed on Laura Lopes caused such intense friction. It was never viewed as a mere cancelled holiday, but rather interpreted by observers as the literal redrawing of a royal boundary line. Ancestral generations recognized that staying at Sandringham was an elite honor rather than an automatic right. Its living quarters, its guest registries, and its confidential daily habits have historically mirrored the deepest doctrines of the crown. The institution itself must always eclipse the individual family unit, and personal intimacy does not automatically translate into institutional access. Whispers indicate that high-ranking figures had become increasingly uncomfortable with how far unofficial leverage might creep if these traditional lines were allowed to soften. Granting one quiet concession could pave the way for another. A single unpublicized exception could easily establish a new norm, and within an organization anchored entirely by symbolism, setting a new norm can be incredibly hazardous. This explains why the surrounding hush felt so incredibly suffocating. No official wanted to speak out of turn, because uttering too much would openly acknowledge that Sandringham had been transformed into a political battleground. Insiders note that Camilla likely interpreted the dilemma through the perspective of maternal allegiance. Charles, conversely, was said to be cornered into adopting a much colder, far less accommodating viewpoint, the absolute defense of the crown's private domains at a historical juncture where every single action was being measured against historical legacy. Beneath the elegant exterior, deep-rooted friction was starting to surface, manifesting not as an open war, but as an invisible pressure intensifying behind the pristine masonry of the palace. Once Sandringham was cast as the primary symbol, the conflict could no longer be minimized as a minor household spat. It had evolved into a definitive test of sovereign control, organizational confidence, and who truly held a place within the protected inner ring. With the profound gravity of Sandringham fully exposed, scrutiny swiftly pivoted toward the individual suddenly caught in the eye of this palace storm, Laura Lopes herself. For decades, she had successfully steered clear of the relentless media glare that continuously shadowed her mother. Nevertheless, according to narratives traveling among court analysts, her identity was suddenly thrust into one of the most sensitive internal debates the palace had seen in years. The issue at hand had ceased to be about public outings. It was entirely about her physical proximity to the center of royal power. Laura had historically remained one of the least confrontational figures in this grand family narrative, which made her sudden central positioning in this crisis all the more startling. She was never someone associated with explosive media disclosures, public relations drives, or overt defiance toward the crown. Her sway, if she possessed any at all, operated in a quieter, more delicate, nearly imperceptible fashion. In court circles, however, unspoken connections can frequently carry far more weight than official titles listed in a ledger. Reports indicate that top-tier strategists started raising an incredibly uncomfortable query. Exactly where does internal family affection terminate, and where does official crown access begin? That particular inquiry carried a massive emotional toll, because it pulled Camilla's private family life into a much harsher spotlight. Laura herself was never blamed for seeking authority. Even so, her name became inextricably linked to a mounting anxiety within the palace that informal leverage could quietly seep through domestic channels without ever receiving an official announcement. Once that specific anxiety was voiced behind closed doors, it could not be easily brushed aside. For Camilla, any move to restrict her daughter likely felt intensely malicious, perhaps even a public slight. For Charles, it reportedly morphed into a far weightier challenge, a test of whether the crown could successfully maintain its walls even when the friction originated from inside his own immediate household. Palace analysts started connecting minor details that had previously seemed entirely unrelated. Private weekend cards, country estate permissions, hushed discussions, and the meticulous control over who was permitted near the monarch's inner sanctum. Every new detail added validity to the theory that this was not some standalone tiff, but rather a single chapter in a much larger conflict over the ultimate distribution of royal influence. Whispers suggest that senior court strategists were not merely fretting over Laura as an individual. Their primary dread was the establishment of a precedent. If one side of the blended family secured casual entry simply due to marital connections, what would prevent other relatives from demanding identical treatment? That was the perilous question lingering beneath the placid surface. The institution could easily weather tabloid gossip, but it absolutely could not tolerate ambiguity regarding ultimate command. As Laura's name transitioned from confidential palace memos into mainstream media speculation, the silence enveloping her situation grew even more profound. It painted a picture of a family striving to maintain a unified front, while the institution itself quietly tightened its grip. Behind the intense arguments regarding Laura's status lay a far more intricate dilemma, centered on two entirely clashing viewpoints regarding the future path of the crown. The ongoing feud had escalated far beyond a dispute over a single country house visit. Court sources reveal it had been absorbed into a much larger ideological war between factions prioritizing domestic relationships and those unyieldingly committed to upholding ancient palace protocol. This internal battle was reportedly reaching the absolute peak of the royal hierarchy. Beneath the polite, calculated language of court diplomacy, a much sharper institutional war was developing. One faction argued that Charles, fulfilling his role as a husband and patriarch within a modern blended family, ought to permit domestic affection to round off the sharp edges of rigid protocol. On the opposite side stood advisors who reportedly dreaded that making even one emotionally driven exception could compromise the structural integrity of the entire system. Within a monarchy, regulations are never mere guidelines. They serve as profound public indicators. They signal to the world who carries weight, who genuinely belongs, and who has earned the right to be trusted. This is precisely why the reported ban of Laura Lopes from the Sandringham grounds became such a heavily loaded issue. It served as an implicit declaration that entry into the sovereign family's private havens would not be granted merely by virtue of being related to Camilla. Any such entry had to withstand a much more rigorous evaluation, one rooted in institutional duty, absolute discretion, and organizational necessity. Rumors of emergency meetings began to leak out, with high-ranking palace figures allegedly debating not just Laura's specific status, but the highly dangerous future trajectory such concessions could trigger. If the gates of Sandringham were thrown open too wide, what would follow? Would other extended branches of the family expect the same cordiality, the same entitlements, and the same tacit validation? If those expectations multiplied, who within the palace would possess the fortitude to deny them? According to royal chatter, Charles found himself immobilized between two immensely powerful currents. Camilla insisted that loyalty toward her own children be honored. Simultaneously, the ancient administrative machinery of the crown demanded that sovereign perimeters remain completely unyielding. This intense friction reportedly left the king in an excruciatingly painful dilemma, as every available path forward promised its own form of distress. Choosing to back Camilla meant risking the appearance of degrading the sacred boundaries of the monarchy. Conversely, enforcing the restriction meant risking a deep emotional wound to the woman standing by his side. This embodies the profound emotional ruthlessness of wearing the crown. The institution rarely permits the heart to dictate terms. As both sides dug in, the palace's absolute refusal to comment began to look less like standard discretion and more like a desperate containment strategy. A fundamental shift had occurred. A private family dispute had officially transformed into a political trial within the royal household, demonstrating just how vulnerable personal influence becomes when the institution decides to close ranks. As both factions solidified their stances behind the scenes, all eyes turned back to the sovereign and the agonizing choice he would ultimately be forced to hand down. That was the precise moment when quiet palace whispers erupted into front-page news. Leakage from the palace indicates that a private debate reached a sudden, dramatic breaking point, giving rise to the now celebrated account of Charles abruptly severing his telephone link with Camilla. No matter what words were actually spoken in those closing seconds, insiders maintain it served as the ultimate turning point. Prior to that moment, the entire feud had existed purely in the shadows, cloaked by palace secrecy and softened by diplomatic phrasing. However, the second the narrative of that terminated call began circulating through court networks, the entire environment transformed. It was no longer viewed as a quiet family tiff over holiday lodging. It sounded like a monarch definitively laying down the law. Sources close to the situation indicated that tempers were running extraordinarily high, not because of one single rejected visit, but due to the massive symbolic weight that the request carried. Camilla, according to these accounts, was determined to have the decision reevaluated. Charles, however, completely exhausted by pressure from his inner circle of advisors, public scrutiny, and the profound obligation of maintaining royal continuity, reportedly stood firm against allowing the issue to become yet another compromised boundary line. That firm stance carried immense weight, signaling that the palace's long-standing tradition of domestic compromise had finally hit a brick wall. Court employees reportedly observed an instantaneous transformation in the aftermath. Group discussions became noticeably briefer, directives grew far more rigid, and courtiers who had once gossiped openly about domestic scheduling suddenly selected their phrases with extreme trepidation. The surrounding silence became highly structured, the prevailing caution turned entirely deliberate, and outside the palace gates, public theories exploded. Royal experts began questioning whether this was a basic domestic squabble or concrete proof of a far more serious power struggle involving Camilla's inner circle, crown estates, and the king's ultimate sovereignty over private royal properties. The complete absence of official clarification only served to make the narrative more mesmerizing to the public. Every question left unanswered gave rise to yet another theory. Who was the first to bring up Laura's visiting privileges? Who officially authorized the restriction? Did Charles issue the decree entirely on his own? Or was he pushed by a coalition of advisors, single-mindedly devoted to preventing Sandringham from becoming a symbol of expanding non-royal leverage? These unresolved issues hovered over the House of Windsor like a gathering storm. For Camilla, that alleged sudden disconnection carried an incredibly harsh emotional realization. It was not merely a conversation cut short, but a stark reminder that even the Queen can be firmly overruled when the core institution feels compromised. Public fascination spiked dramatically because the incident managed to feel profoundly personal and heavily political all at once. A marriage, a household, a historic estate, and the crown itself had all collided within a single fractured dialogue. Yet, the true gravity of this confrontation would only materialize as the long-term fallout began to surface. What materialized next was not a dramatic official proclamation, but rather something far more telling: complete and total silence. According to royal analysts, the utter lack of any clarification served only to stoke public theories that the argument had laid bare deep structural rifts within the sovereign household. No official press release was issued to smooth over the rough edges, and no carefully worded denial emerged from the palace to dismiss the rumors. Instead, the narrative was permitted to fester within the vacuum left in its wake. For those watching the court closely, that very vacuum functioned as a distinct form of validation. Royal experts began analyzing the complete absence of speech just as intensely as they had analyzed the whispered rumors. Why would the palace actively debunk minor tabloid stories, but leave this specific narrative completely unaddressed? Why allow reports of severe friction between Charles and Camilla to dominate public discourse unless the underlying reality was simply too volatile to handle? With every passing hour of total silence, the inquiries grew increasingly pointed. Instantly, all upcoming family events were subjected to intense public evaluation. Would Laura be seen at upcoming private family gatherings? Would Sandringham continue to be locked away from specific members of Camilla's extended family? Would Charles quietly retract his decree over time? Or would the restrictions remain firmly in place as a stern warning to anyone assuming that personal intimacy could unlock royal doors? These had ceased to be basic etiquette questions. They now bore the full weight of court hierarchy, personal allegiance, and institutional integrity. Reports hinted that the internal friction persisted long after the telephone line went dead. It did not manifest through loud arguments, but rather through the chilly, detached methods by which royal feuds typically endure: curtailed dialogues, calculated seating arrangements, delayed invitations, and directives transmitted via intermediaries rather than discussed face-to-face. Camilla, according to informants, was said to be deeply shaken by the underlying message of the encounter. Meanwhile, Charles was reportedly facing continuous pressure to demonstrate that the crown's private sanctuaries could never be rearranged to satisfy personal, emotional pleas. Beyond the palace walls, the grander public conversation expanded significantly. Certain observers viewed the reported exclusion as unnecessarily cruel, a bleak reminder that court existence can be entirely ruthless, even to individuals brought in through marriage. Others interpreted it as an essential act of institutional governance, clear evidence that the monarch still recognized the vast gulf separating family affection from institutional honor. This stark polarization ensured the controversy remained impossible to push aside. It was never merely a dispute about Sandringham. It was a fundamental debate over whether the contemporary monarchy could retain its humanity without becoming reckless, show empathy without projecting frailty, and protect its privacy without rendering itself exposed. Every period of silence, every refusal to issue a denial, and every carefully evaded question caused the internal wound to feel that much deeper. While the front-page news remained fixated on the immediate friction, the far more significant question hung in the air. What did this truly portend for the future of the crown itself? At its absolute core, this entire feud was never merely about a broken telephone conversation or a country house. It was fundamentally about heritage. As reports continued to multiply, commentators increasingly framed the crisis as a single chapter in a much larger struggle over how the crown must modernize, while simultaneously safeguarding the ancient customs that give it meaning. Charles stood directly in the center of that battlefield, trapped between two entirely incompatible worlds. On one side was the private existence he had spent decades fighting to shield, a marriage that had endured through epic public criticism, and the domestic alliances tied to Camilla's extended family. On the opposite side stood the cold, unyielding obligation of kingship, an arena where personal affection must unconditionally surrender to institutional continuity, and where even the most trivial domestic decree transforms into a message broadcast to the entire world. This is precisely why Camilla's standing within the palace began drawing intense, renewed scrutiny. It was not triggered solely by this single reported argument, but because the incident seemed to trigger the much larger, lingering question that has shadowed her for decades. Exactly how much sway should her private family circle be permitted to hold over the crown? To her loyalists, she remained the dedicated partner to a monarch navigating immense personal and physical stress. To her detractors, the Sandringham standoff appeared to validate uncomfortable anxieties regarding access, influence, and the unspoken reach of non-royal domestic networks. Royal commentators began highlighting historical precedents, reminding the public that the monarchy has managed to endure through the centuries not by being sentimental, but by remaining ruthlessly disciplined. It has successfully survived abdications, betrayals, internal scandals, and massive public outcries precisely because, at every critical junction, the institution chooses institutional survival over personal comfort. Through that uncompromising royal lens, Sandringham ceased to be a mere vacation home and became a definitive legal test case. If Charles allowed emotional pleading to alter the regulations there, what would stop the same erosion from happening at Balmoral, Windsor, or any other private sovereign space anchored to history? Conversely, if he stood his ground, he risked exacerbating a profound personal rift with Camilla, leaving her children feeling completely pushed out to the fringes of court life. There was no path to an easy triumph, only different variations of institutional and personal damage. This exact dynamic is what rendered the crisis so thoroughly transfixing to the public. It showcased institutional triumph and personal heartbreak completely locked in tandem. Camilla's incredible journey to becoming queen alongside Charles stood in sharp opposition to the harsh boundaries now reportedly constructed around her own children. Charles's devotion as a protective husband clashed directly with his supreme accountability as sovereign. Laura's intentionally quiet life was suddenly sucked into a media whirlwind she had never publicly invited. This classic narrative of the institution versus the family unit gained massive traction because it spoke directly to the oldest truth of the monarchy. The crown is fully capable of love, but it can never be personally owned by anyone. It must always tower above every single private wound. Ultimately, the closing chapter of this narrative might expose a reality far more significant than which faction won this specific argument. Long after these specific rumors quiet down and the front-page news shifts elsewhere, the intense friction involving Charles, Camilla, Laura Lopes, and the Sandringham estate will likely be remembered for an entirely different reason. It provided the world with a rare, unfiltered look into the agonizing decisions required to shield an institution resting upon centuries of unyielding tradition. Beneath the chaotic media speculation lay a stark, painful reality. The monarchy does not function like a normal human family. It lacks the freedom to bend just because an individual's feelings are hurt, and it cannot soften its stance simply because a private relationship demands it. In its most brutal hours, the crown endures by choosing duty over personal comfort, structural order over human emotion, and historical legacy over individual longing. This is the exact reason why Sandringham carried such immense gravity throughout this entire saga. It stood as an unyielding monument to historical continuity, a protected space where sovereign legacy and institutional accountability consistently outweighed basic family expectations. If Laura Lopes was indeed barred from that inner ring, the underlying message was unmistakable. Entry into sovereign spaces cannot be inherited through marital proximity alone. It must be explicitly earned through trust, institutional purpose, and the specific requirements of the crown. For Camilla, that realization would have been an incredibly bitter pill to swallow. For Charles, it likely represented one of the most isolating, agonizing choices of his entire time on the throne, because safeguarding the monarchy required him to permit emotional distress directly inside his own home. For the general public, the entire crisis served as a vivid reminder that private royal arguments instantly assume national importance the moment they touch upon the future structural shape of the crown. The core mysteries endure. What specific words were actually traded during that final call? Who lobbied most aggressively for the restriction to be enforced? Did Charles act purely out of personal principle, intense pressure from his advisors, or a combination of both forces? The palace will almost certainly never provide the answers. Yet, within the realm of royalty, unanswered questions frequently become a core part of the historical legacy. They leave behind an enduring shadow, a stern warning, and a profound lesson. The ultimate survival of the monarchy relies not on grand ceremonies or glittering titles, but entirely on public trust. That trust is successfully maintained only when the boundaries remain completely transparent, even when those identical boundaries cut incredibly deep. This was the brutal polarization resting at the very epicenter of the entire scandal. The immense success of Camilla's ascension alongside Charles contrasted against the agonizing reality of seeing that ascension reach its absolute structural limits, the king's fierce adoration as a spouse clashing with his heavy burden as the supreme ruler. The emotional warmth of a family unit colliding with the cold, unyielding discipline of the crown. As the heavy gates of Sandringham closed to the world once more, the institution forged ahead, leaving behind a bitter controversy that history may remember not for the specific argument itself, but for what it illuminated about the absolute, enduring supremacy of duty over personal desire. Thanks for watching.